It had been years since Lisa had returned to her childhood home. After her parents passed away, she inherited the house, a dusty old relic filled with memories she'd rather forget. But with bills piling up and no other options, she made the decision to move back. The house was the same as she remembered: creaky floorboards, dim lighting, and an unsettling sense of being watched. Her parents had always been secretive about the house's history, but she'd heard whispers growing up. Whispers about strange occurrences and voices that came from empty rooms. She shrugged them off as childhood fears, but now, standing in the echoing silence of the old place, she felt those fears creeping back. It was on her second day in the house that she discovered the attic. While cleaning out the cluttered second-floor hallway, Lisa noticed the pull string for the attic hatch hanging down, something she had never seen before. Curious, she pulled it and the ladder creaked open. A cloud of dust puffed into the air as the wooden steps unfolded. She hesitated for a moment before climbing up. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and cobwebs thick enough to obscure her view. As Lisa waved her flashlight around, it caught something that gleamed in the far corner. A mirror. It was an antique, tall, with a heavy wooden frame, intricately carved with swirling patterns and symbols she didn't recognize. The surface of the mirror was dusty and grimy, but she could still see her reflection in it, distorted slightly by the dirt. Something about it drew her in, an eerie fascination she couldn't shake. She wiped at the glass, revealing more of her reflection. As she did, a strange sensation washed over her, as though she wasn't alone. Her reflection was there, but there was something wrong about it. Something subtle, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Lisa stared at the mirror, her eyes locked on her own reflection. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. Movement. Not in the room, but in the mirror. Her reflection's hand twitched just for a second, even though she hadn't moved. Lisa blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She stepped back, away from the mirror, her breath quickening. No, she muttered to herself. It's just your mind playing tricks. Determined not to freak herself out, she turned away from the mirror and continued to sift through the boxes. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. After a few more minutes, she decided to head back downstairs. That night, Lisa lay in bed, trying to push the strange experience out of her mind. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her reflection in that mirror, standing perfectly still while the world around it moved. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the exhaustion from moving back into the house, but deep down, she knew something was off. At around 2 a.m., a noise jolted her awake. It was faint, like a soft tapping sound, but in the silence of the house, it felt deafening. Lisa sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking. It was coming from the ceiling. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized it was coming from the attic, right above her room. Gathering her courage, Lisa grabbed her flashlight and headed up the stairs. The house seemed to grow colder with every step, the shadows stretching and twisting in the dim light. The attic hatch was still open, the ladder still down, waiting for her. She climbed up, her hands trembling as she pulled herself into the attic. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same dusty furniture and boxes. But something was different this time. The mirror. It was no longer in the corner where she had left it. It was now in the center of the attic, facing her directly, as though someone had moved it. Lisa's throat went dry as she stared at it, her pulse quickening. Slowly, she approached the mirror, her reflection growing clearer with each step. But then she saw it. Her reflection wasn't alone. Standing behind her in the dim recesses of the glass was another figure, a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with long, tangled hair that hung over her face. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress, and her eyes, empty, hollow, were fixed on Lisa's reflection. Lisa whipped around, but no one was there. The attic was empty. She turned back to the mirror, and the woman was gone. Lisa's heart raced as she stumbled back from the mirror, her breath shallow. She had to get out of the attic, out of the house. But before she could move, a cold hand clamped down on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but once again there was nothing. Shaking, Lisa ran down the ladder and slammed the attic hatch shut behind her. She locked herself in her bedroom, every nerve on edge. Sleep was impossible now. Every sound, every creak of the house felt like a threat, like something moving just beyond her vision. The next morning, she called a repairman to bolt the attic shut. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she couldn't let whatever was up there come down. Days passed, and Lisa avoided the attic at all costs, trying to convince herself that it had all been a bad dream. But on the 7th night, she awoke again to the sound of knocking. This time, it wasn't from the attic. It was closer, from the mirror in her bedroom. Lisa's blood ran cold. She hadn't brought the mirror down from the attic, but there it was, standing in the corner of her room. The same mirror. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and this time, she knew it wasn't coming from the other side of the glass. It was coming from inside. With trembling hands, Lisa grabbed a blanket and covered the mirror, but the knocking continued, now accompanied by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me out." Lisa backed away, tears streaming down her face as the knocking grew into a frantic pounding. "Let me out." The voice was louder now, almost shrieking, and as Lisa watched in horror, the blanket covering the mirror began to move, as though something was pressing against it from inside the glass, trying to break free. The last thing Lisa heard before she fled the house, never to return, was a final, desperate whisper from the mirror. "You're next." Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a chilly autumn evening when Matt, Lucy, and Aaron arrived at the edge of the Blackthorn Woods. The locals called it a cursed forest, but to the three friends it was just another place to explore for a thrill. They had heard the stories, of course, of the Lantern Man, who wandered the woods at night, luring lost souls deeper into the trees, but they laughed it off as a silly campfire tale. "It's just a legend to keep people from getting lost," Aaron said confidently as they walked down the narrow path. He swung his flashlight back and forth, illuminating the dark trees. Nothing's gonna happen. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, an unsettling silence fell over them. The sounds of crickets and rustling leaves faded away, replaced by the stillness of the trees. The path became more narrow and twisted, as if the woods themselves were closing in around them. Lucy, who had been quiet since they started the hike, finally spoke up. "Do you guys feel strange? Like we're being watched?" Matt, the most skeptical of the group, shrugged. "It's just your imagination. This place is creepy, sure, but there's no Lantern Man. We'll make it to the old cemetery and prove it's all just a bunch of stories." The cemetery was rumored to be hidden deep within Blackthorn Woods, where the Lantern Man had supposedly first appeared decades ago. According to legend, he was a lost soul himself, a man who had perished in the woods while searching for his family, cursed to wander forever with his lantern, trying to find his way home. As they continued walking, Aaron's flashlight flickered, then went out. He cursed under his breath and slapped the side of the flashlight. "Great. Batteries are dead." Matt pulled out his own flashlight and clicked it on. "Here, use mine," he said, handing it over. "Thanks," Aaron muttered, taking the light. But as he took a step forward, something caught their attention. A faint, glowing light in the distance, far deeper in the woods. It bobbed up and down, slowly moving through the trees. Lucy gasped, her eyes wide. "What is that? Is someone else out here?" Aaron and Matt exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe it's another group of hikers," Matt suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. But the light was strange. It wasn't the cold, bright beam of a flashlight. Instead, it glowed softly like an old oil lantern. It moved slowly, as if whoever was holding it was gliding through the forest. Without saying a word, they found themselves drawn to it, stepping off the path and into the denser part of the woods. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to reach out to them, their branches like skeletal fingers. Lucy hesitated. "We shouldn't go this way. We don't know who or what that is." But Aaron, always the brave one, shook his head. "It's probably just someone trying to mess with us. Let's get closer and see." As they moved toward the light, it suddenly flickered and disappeared, leaving them in total darkness. Aaron cursed again, swinging the flashlight around. Where did it go? Then, without warning, the light reappeared, this time much closer. It was just beyond the trees, illuminating the silhouette of a tall figure. The figure stood completely still, holding a lantern high in one hand. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its presence was unmistakably eerie. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. That's him. That's the Lantern Man. Don't be ridiculous, Matt whispered, though his voice shook. It's probably just someone messing with us. But deep down, they all knew something wasn't right. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them from the edge of the trees. The lantern's glow cast long, twisted shadows across the ground, making the forest seem even more otherworldly. Suddenly, the figure began to move, gliding silently through the trees toward them. "Run," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." Aaron nodded, backing away slowly. But before they could turn and flee, the figure vanished again. the light winking out as if snuffed by an invisible hand. "Where did it go?" Matt asked, his voice tight with fear. A cold breeze swept through the trees and they heard it, a faint, raspy voice like the wind whispering through the leaves. "Come closer. I need help. I'm lost." Lucy's eyes widened in terror. "We need to leave. Now." They turned and bolted through the woods, running blindly in the dark. The branches tore at their clothes and the uneven ground made it difficult to keep their footing, but they didn't care. All they could think about was getting as far away from that light as possible. But as they ran, they realized something horrifying. They were no longer on the path. The forest around them was unfamiliar, twisted, and dark. The trees seemed to close in, and the deeper they went, the more lost they became. Aaron stopped, panting. Where are we?" "We're lost," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "Just like him." Matt looked around wildly. "No, we can't be. We were just following the path." But as they stood there, trying to figure out where they had gone wrong, the light appeared again, this time right behind them. They turned slowly, dread settling in their stomachs. The lantern man was there, his glowing lantern casting eerie shadows across his gaunt face. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He opened his mouth, and the same raspy whisper escaped. "Help me. I'm lost." Without thinking, they ran again, but no matter how fast they moved, the light followed them, always staying just behind, flickering in and out of sight like a ghostly will-o'-the-wisp. Finally, exhausted and terrified, they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling gravestone covered in moss and barely legible, but the name on the stone sent a chill down their spines. It read, "Edgar Wren, the Lantern Man, lost in these woods, never to return." The lantern light flickered one last time, casting Edgar's ghostly figure across the clearing. He stepped forward, his hollow eyes locking onto theirs. "You're lost too," he whispered, and then the lantern went out, plunging the clearing into darkness. The three friends screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the night, and the woods were silent once more. None of them were ever seen again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
In the quiet town of Hollow Creek, the old Oakwood Manor stood abandoned, its dark silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. The manor had been the subject of countless ghost stories and whispered legends, but none frightened the townsfolk more than the tale of the whispering shadows. They said that anyone who dared to enter the manor after sunset would never return the same. The story began with a family that lived in the manor over a century ago. The Oakhurst family, known for their wealth and prestige, mysteriously vanished one stormy night. Local rumors suggested that the parents had gone mad, driven to insanity by the dark spirits that inhabited the house. The children, too frightened to escape, were said to be seen roaming the halls, their laughter echoing through the empty rooms long after they disappeared. As time passed, the manor fell into ruin, becoming a source of intrigue for adventurous teens. One fateful October night, 4 friends, Jake, Emily, Marcus, and Sarah, decided to brave the manor's haunted halls, spurred on by tales of paranormal activity. They packed flashlights, snacks, and a Ouija board, laughing off their fear as they approached the creaking front door. As they entered, the air felt thick and oppressive. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights, illuminating the faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the occasional scuttle of a rat. Jake, the bravest of the group, led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as they moved deeper into the house. "Let's start in the parlor," Emily suggested, her voice trembling slightly. She had always been a believer in the supernatural, and the stories about the manor sent shivers down her spine. The parlor was grand once, with an ornate fireplace and intricately carved furniture, now covered in dust. As they set up the Ouija board on a rickety table, a chill ran through the room, and Sarah couldn't help but feel as if they were being watched. "Who wants to go first?" Marcus asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jake smirked. "I will. Let's see what we can find out." He placed his fingers lightly on the planchette, beckoning the others to join him. They all reluctantly placed their fingers on the wooden piece, and Jake began to call out into the void. "Is there anyone here with us?" At first, there was silence, but as the minutes ticked by, the planchette began to move, ever so slightly. Emily gasped as it slid to yes. The others exchanged nervous glances. "What's your name?" Jake pressed, excitement and fear coursing through him. The planchette began to move again, spelling out Eliza. The air grew colder, and a faint whisper echoed in the room, sending chills down Sarah's spine. "Leave," it seemed to say, though the words were indistinct like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," Jake said, his bravado faltering. Eliza, why do we need to leave? The planchette moved once more, spelling danger. Suddenly the temperature dropped even more. A loud crash echoed from the hallway, causing them to jump. The group exchanged terrified looks, but Jake insisted, we have to see what it was. As they crept into the dark hallway, a feeling of dread settled in their stomachs. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, creating eerie shapes on the walls. Emily clutched Sarah's arm tightly, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and incoherent, but a single word pierced through. Help. They followed the sound, drawn deeper into the manor. Each step felt like a descent into madness, the walls closing in around them. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway. Its surface warped and splintered. Should we go in? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Let's see what's inside, Jake replied, pushing the door open. It creaked ominously, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with dusty toys and faded photographs. In the center stood an old rocking chair that began to sway back and forth, as if an unseen child were playing. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. Panic set in as they fumbled in the dark, trying to turn them back on. The whispers intensified, swirling around them like a violent storm. Get out! Get out! They cried, their voices merging into a chaotic cacophony. Just then, the rocking chair stopped moving and the door slammed shut behind them. They were trapped. The air grew heavy and a cold dread filled the room. Emily screamed, What do we do? Let's try to push the door! Jake shouted, his voice laced with panic. They rushed to the door, slamming their shoulders against it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, now sounding like a chorus of tormented souls pleading for release. Help us, a voice cried out, more distinct this time. Help us find peace. In that moment, Sarah noticed a dusty mirror hanging on the wall. She felt a strange pull towards it. Look, maybe we can break the mirror. But as she moved closer, her reflection wavered, distorting into the image of a girl, Eliza. Her eyes were hollow, filled with sorrow and fear. You must leave. They will come for you, she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. Fear gripped Sarah's heart. Who will come for us? The shadows, Eliza replied, her voice fading. They hunger for souls. Jake turned to the others, his face pale. We need to get out now. With a burst of adrenaline, they charged at the door one last time. This time, it cracked open slightly, and they stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The whispers grew frantic, urging them to flee. They sprinted through the darkened rooms, the shadows swirling around them like hungry wolves. Just as they reached the front door, a freezing hand grasped Jake's ankle, pulling him down. Help, he shouted, but the shadows engulfed him, dragging him back into the darkness. The rest of the group screamed, desperate to save him, but they knew they had to escape. Racing into the night, they didn't look back until they reached the safety of the streetlights outside. They collapsed on the ground, panting and trembling, the horrific memories of the manor fresh in their minds. But as they looked back at the looming Oakwood Manor, they realized the whispers had followed them. From the shadows, a figure emerged, pale and translucent, the silhouette of Eliza, forever bound to the darkness. Help us, she murmured, her voice fading into the night as she vanished back into the shadows of the house. From that night on, Hollow Creek would never be the same. The remaining friends spoke of their harrowing experience, warning others to stay away from Oakwood Manor. But the whispers continued, echoing through the night, waiting for the next curious soul to answer their call.
Story number 4.
Deep in the heart of Silverpine Forest, there's a trail that no one in the nearby village dares to tread. The path, overgrown with thorny vines and shrouded in mist, leads to a place only spoken of in hushed tones, the Whispering Woods. Generations of villagers had passed down tales of the forest, where those who wandered in would never return, their fates sealed by the voices that lived among the trees. Some say the forest is cursed, others claim it's haunted by the souls of the lost, but no one really knows the truth, except for Lily. Lily had grown up in the village, hearing the stories from her grandmother, who always ended the tale with the same warning. If you hear the whispers, you must leave at once. Never follow the voices, or they'll take you too. As a child, Lily took the warning seriously, but as she grew older, she dismissed it as nothing more than an old folktale, designed to scare children and keep them from wandering too far. Now in her 20s, she scoffed at the idea of haunted woods. To her, it was just another superstition in a town full of them. One evening, after an argument with her boyfriend, Lily stormed out of the house, desperate for some air. The sunset painted the sky in hues of red and gold as she walked aimlessly through the village, her anger guiding her steps. Without realizing it, She found herself at the edge of Silverpine Forest, staring down the path that led to the infamous Whispering Woods. Frustration boiled within her. "It's just a forest," she muttered under her breath, pushing aside the warnings that had been drilled into her head. With a stubborn resolve, she stepped onto the trail. The deeper she went, the quieter the world around her became. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways, their branches like bony fingers reaching toward her. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened, curling around her feet as if trying to pull her back. But Lily kept walking, her heart pounding in her chest, more from adrenaline than fear. She had only been walking for about 15 minutes when she heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint, almost like the rustling of leaves, but distinct enough to make her feel uneasy. Lily turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest around her, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. It sounded like a voice. No, several voices, murmuring just out of earshot. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky despite her attempt to sound brave. There was no response, just the continued whispering, as if the voices were having a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. A cold chill crawled down her spine. She remembered her grandmother's words. "If you hear the whispers, you must leave at once." Lily took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to turn around. But then the whispers changed. Instead of the soft, unintelligible murmurs, one voice stood out, clearer than the others. "Lily," it called, her name drifting on the wind. Her heart stopped. She froze in place. How did it know her name? "Lily," the voice repeated, this time closer, clearer. It was a woman's voice, soft and sweet, like the lullabies her mother used to sing when she was a child. The voice was familiar, and yet she couldn't place it. "Come closer," the voice whispered. "We've been waiting for you." A shiver ran down her spine, but her feet wouldn't move. Despite every fiber of her being telling her to run, there was something hypnotic about the voice, something soothing. It wrapped around her like a blanket, lulling her into a strange sense of calm. Her fear began to melt away, replaced by a curiosity she couldn't explain. The mist swirled around her feet, guiding her deeper into the forest. The trees, though gnarled and menacing before, now seemed to beckon her forward, their branches parting as if to clear the way. "Lily, come with us," the voice whispered again, almost playful now. It seemed to come from just beyond the next cluster of trees. She moved toward it, her steps slow, deliberate. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm, yanking her backward with such force that she nearly fell. Lily gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, behind her. But there was no one. The whispers stopped. Lily stood there, her pulse racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air felt heavy again, and the forest around her grew darker, more sinister. "Go back," a new voice whispered, this one low, gravely. It wasn't soothing like the first, it was a command. Without thinking, Lily turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth as she fled back down the path. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and bending in unnatural ways as if trying to trap her. The whispers returned, louder now, frantic and angry. "Don't leave us! Come back! You belong here!" Lily's legs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, the voices growing louder, more desperate. She could feel something behind her, chasing her, its presence pressing down on her like a weight. She didn't dare look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she burst out of the forest and onto the dirt road that led back to the village. She stumbled, nearly collapsing in exhaustion. The whispers stopped abruptly, as though the forest itself had released its grip on her. Breathing heavily, she looked back at the tree line. The mist still swirled between the trees, but the voices were gone. The forest stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Lily never returned to the Whispering Woods. She moved away from the village a few weeks later, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to return. Years later, when asked about that night, she would only say one thing: "They're still waiting." Story the end.
Story number 5.
Blackwood Manor stood at the edge of town, a towering relic of a forgotten era. For decades it had been abandoned, its windows shattered and its walls overtaken by ivy. Locals whispered about the manor, claiming it was cursed, haunted by something far worse than ghosts. People who dared to enter often came back changed, or worse, they didn't come back at all. But to Emily, the rumors sounded like nothing more than ghost stories meant to scare away curious kids. She was a thrill seeker, always chasing the next adrenaline rush. So when her friends dared her to spend a night in Blackwood Manor, she eagerly accepted. "What's the worst that could happen?" she said, brushing off their warnings. The evening of the dare, Emily packed her flashlight, some snacks, and a sleeping bag, determined to prove them all wrong. Her friends dropped her off at the manor's entrance, the tall iron gate creaking as it swung open. The air felt colder here, like a different season entirely had taken over Blackwood's grounds. Still, Emily pushed forward, heart racing with anticipation. The front door, though ancient and rotting, opened with ease. She stepped inside, greeted by the smell of damp wood and decay. Dust swirled in the dim beam of her flashlight as she scanned the vast, empty foyer. A grand staircase led up to the second floor, its once polished banister now cracked and dull. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seemingly watching her every move. Emily set up her sleeping bag near the fireplace, though she had no intention of sleeping. She'd spend the night exploring every corner of the manor, documenting her adventure to show her friends later. But as she started toward the stairs, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the flame of her flashlight. Panic surged in her chest as she fumbled to turn it back on. The light flickered back to life, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around her, and there was a sound, soft at first, like distant whispers. Emily spun around, shining the light in every direction, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, coming from all around her. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. "Okay, guys, very funny," Emily shouted, thinking her friends might have snuck in to scare her, but no one answered. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away toward the front door. But when she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. She was locked in. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, from the top of the stairs, she heard a voice, low and guttural. "You shouldn't be here." Emily's blood ran cold. She aimed her flashlight toward the staircase, and there, standing at the top, was a figure cloaked in shadow. Its features were obscured, but its eyes glowed a dull, malevolent red. The figure started descending the stairs, each step slow and purposeful. Frozen in place, Emily could barely breathe. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but her body refused to move. The figure reached the bottom of the staircase and paused, staring directly at her. In that moment, a wave of dread washed over her, a primal fear that she had never felt before. She knew, without a doubt, that this was no prank. The figure spoke again, its voice echoing through the room like a distant growl. "This house is mine. You will join them." Before Emily could react, the floor beneath her feet groaned, and she was suddenly pulled down, her legs sinking into the wooden boards as if the house itself was devouring her. She screamed, thrashing to free herself, but it was no use. The more she struggled, the deeper she sank. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic now, surrounding her in a deafening chorus. Faces, distorted, twisted in agony, began to materialize in the walls, their mouths opening in silent screams. Emily realized then that these were the souls trapped within the manor, victims of whatever ancient evil resided there. Her body was nearly submerged in the floor when she remembered her flashlight. With one last effort, she shone the beam directly at the figure. To her surprise, it recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing in anger. The light seemed to weaken its hold on her, and for a brief second she was able to pull herself free from the floor's grip. Without thinking, she bolted toward the nearest window, crashing through the glass and tumbling onto the overgrown lawn outside. The whispers and the footsteps faded into the distance as she scrambled to her feet, heart pounding, breath ragged. She didn't stop running until she was well beyond the manor's gate. Her friends were waiting by the car, laughing and joking, oblivious to the terror she had just escaped. But when they saw the look on her face, their smiles quickly faded. "What happened?" one of them asked, concern lacing his voice. Emily could barely speak. "We have to go. Now," she managed to say. They didn't argue. The car sped off, leaving Blackwood Manor behind in the darkness. Later, Emily tried to explain what had happened, but no one truly believed her. They chalked it up to her imagination, the power of suggestion in a creepy old house. But Emily knew the truth. Blackwood Manor was alive, an ancient, malevolent entity that had claimed countless souls over the years, and it was still waiting, hungry for more. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Years had passed since Emily's grandmother passed away, leaving her a grand, creaky old house just outside the small town of Clearwater. The house was filled with dust-covered memories, antique furniture, and an attic that no one had dared enter for decades. Growing up, Emily had heard stories about the attic, Stories that her grandmother would share with a dark glint in her eyes, saying, "Some things are better left alone, dear." When Emily inherited the house, she thought little of those tales. She was practical, not one to believe in ghost stories or haunted places. But after a few weeks of living there, strange things began to happen. At night, the floors above her creaked with slow, deliberate footsteps. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, and sometimes she could swear she heard faint whispers in the walls. Determined to get to the bottom of the odd occurrences, Emily decided it was time to venture into the attic. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the narrow wooden staircase. The door at the top was old, its paint peeling and handle rusted. It opened with a groan that echoed down the hall. The attic was vast and filled with dusty boxes and old furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of forgotten years. But what drew Emily's attention wasn't the clutter. It was an enormous antique mirror standing in the far corner, its surface dulled with age. Its intricate wooden frame was adorned with carvings of roses, now faded and chipped. Emily approached the mirror slowly, her flashlight beam bouncing off its surface. Something about it seemed off. She reached out and wiped away a layer of dust, revealing her reflection beneath the grime. But as her fingers brushed the cold glass, her reflection flickered, just for a second, and she thought she saw someone standing behind her. Whirling around, Emily's heart raced, but the attic was empty. She frowned, chalking it up to her nerves. Turning back to the mirror, she examined it closely. The reflection seemed normal now, just her standing alone in the dim attic. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. This time, she knew it wasn't her imagination. There, in the glass, a figure stood behind her, motionless. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was a woman, pale and gaunt, dressed in an old-fashioned white gown. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair that hung in tangled strands. Slowly, the woman in the reflection raised her head, and as she did, a soft whisper echoed through the attic. "Help me." The voice was faint, like a distant plea carried on the wind. Emily backed away from the mirror, but the woman's reflection remained, staring at her with hollow eyes. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. "Help me." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut and the air grew frigid. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she spun around, trying to find a way out. But the door wouldn't budge. The only light now came from the mirror, its surface glowing faintly. She turned back to it, her heart pounding. The woman in the mirror had stepped closer, her face inches from the glass. Emily could see her now, her hollow, sunken cheeks, her cracked lips, and eyes that were filled with unimaginable sorrow. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she reached out with a pale hand, pressing it against the inside of the mirror as though trying to break through. Emily felt a cold dread settle in her chest. Whatever this spirit was, it wasn't just trapped in the glass, it was desperate to escape. "Help me," the whisper came again, more insistent this time. Emily felt a tug at the edge of her consciousness, an overwhelming compulsion to touch the mirror, to help the trapped woman. She found herself stepping forward, her hand reaching out despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. But as her fingers grazed the surface, the woman's sorrowful expression twisted into a wicked grin. Her eyes, once filled with pleading, now burned with malice. The reflection in the mirror began to ripple like disturbed water, and the attic around Emily seemed to warp and bend. The whispers turned into frantic, distorted voices, dozens of them, all shouting over each other, drowning her in a cacophony of desperate cries. "Don't let her out!" they screamed. "Don't touch the mirror!" Emily's heart raced. She tried to pull her hand away, but it was too late. The surface of the mirror had turned ice cold, and her hand was stuck, fused to the glass as if it were a magnet drawing her in. The woman's grin widened as her fingers pushed through the surface of the mirror, cold and real, wrapping around Emily's wrist. Emily screamed, struggling to pull free, but the woman's grip tightened, dragging her toward the mirror's surface. In a desperate bid for survival, Emily kicked over an old wooden chair nearby, sending it crashing into the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, scattering across the attic floor. The woman's hand vanished, and Emily stumbled backward, panting and trembling. For a long moment, the attic was silent again, the oppressive cold lifting. Emily glanced around, her heart still racing, but there was no sign of the ghostly woman. The shattered mirror lay in pieces at her feet, its shards reflecting the dim light like tiny broken windows into another world. Just as Emily began to breathe a sigh of relief, she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, coming from one of the larger shards on the floor. "Help me." The voice was quieter now, but still there, trapped in the broken pieces of the mirror. Emily backed away slowly, her skin crawling with fear. She never returned to the attic after that night. The house, with its creaks and whispers, seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, with each passing day. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still watching her, waiting for her chance to escape. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear the faintest whisper coming from the attic. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Carly had always loved collecting antique dolls. There was something about the craftsmanship, the delicate porcelain faces, the ornate dresses that fascinated her. But it wasn't until she moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town that her collection truly started to grow. Every weekend, she'd scour flea markets, estate sales, and thrift stores for her next find. Her friends thought it was creepy, but Carly didn't mind until the day she brought her home. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when Carly found the doll. She was at an estate sale in the neighboring town, and as soon as she saw the doll, she knew she had to have it. Unlike the others in her collection, this one stood out. The doll was larger than most, almost the size of a small child, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Its hair was long, golden curls, and it wore a pale, frilly dress that looked like something out of the 19th century. As she handed over the money, the elderly woman running the sale gave her a strange look. "You sure you want this one, dear?" she asked in a low, gravelly voice. Carly frowned. "Why? Is something wrong with it?" The woman hesitated, then leaned in closer. "That doll's been in my family for generations. No one wants it around anymore. It brings bad luck." Carly brushed off the warning with a laugh. "Bad luck? It's just a doll." The woman's lips thinned into a tight line, and she shrugged. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." Carly packed the doll into her car, feeling a little uneasy about the exchange, but she quickly pushed it out of her mind. Superstitions weren't something she believed in, and she was excited to add the doll to her growing collection. That evening, she set it in the large bay window of her living room, facing the street. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. It began small. Carly would come home from work to find the doll slightly shifted, facing a different direction than she had left it. At first, she thought maybe she'd accidentally bumped it or that the doll's balance was off. But as the days passed, the changes became more obvious. One night, she returned from an evening out with friends to find the doll sitting in a different chair altogether. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at it. No one else had been in the house, and she was certain she hadn't moved it. Trying to shake off the creeping unease, Carly rationalized that perhaps she had forgotten moving it in her haste that morning. She picked the doll up, carefully placing it back in the window. But then the dreams began. Every night, Carly dreamed of the doll. In her dreams, it wasn't just an inanimate object. It moved, its glassy eyes following her, its porcelain mouth twisting into a smile. Sometimes, it would whisper her name, its voice soft but chilling. "Carly?" In the dreams, the doll would always be standing in the hallway outside her bedroom, watching her, waiting. And every time she tried to move, she couldn't. She was frozen, trapped in her own bed as the doll slowly made its way closer, step by agonizing step. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. But the doll was always in its place by the window, unmoved. One evening, as Carly sat on the couch, staring at the doll, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. The dreams were getting worse, and she was starting to feel like the doll was watching her, really watching her. Every time she passed by the living room, she felt those glassy eyes following her. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. Something was wrong. She grabbed the doll, determined to pack it away in a box and shove it in the attic. As soon as her fingers touched its cold porcelain skin, a strange sensation washed over her, like the room had suddenly grown darker, colder. She shivered and quickly carried the doll to the attic, practically throwing it into a dusty old chest and slamming the lid shut. That night, Carly slept more soundly than she had in days, the heavy weight of the doll's presence finally gone. But her peace didn't last long. At around 3 a.m., she woke to a strange sound, like soft footsteps coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. Her breath hitched as she strained to listen. Thump! 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 The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone or something was walking toward her door. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to dismiss it as her imagination, but the sound was unmistakable. It grew louder, closer, until finally it stopped right outside her door. Carly sat up in bed, every muscle in her body tense. She stared at the door, praying that whatever was out there would go away. But then, the door creaked open, just a crack. And there, standing in the darkness, was the doll. Carly's scream died in her throat as she stared in horror. The doll's eyes glistened in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Slowly, its head tilted to the side, and for the first time, its porcelain lips moved. "Carly," it whispered, the same voice from her dreams. In blind panic, Carly leapt out of bed, grabbing the nearest thing, a heavy book from her nightstand, and hurled it at the doll. It hit the floor with a sickening crack, its porcelain face shattering into pieces. Breathing heavily, Carly stood over the broken doll, her heart racing. Relief washed over her. It was over. Whatever had been haunting her, whatever presence had been attached to the doll, was finally gone. But then, she heard it. A faint, scraping sound. Her eyes darted to the broken pieces of the doll's face. Slowly and possibly, the shards began to move, sliding back together as if pulled by an unseen force. The pieces reassembled themselves, and the doll's face was whole again, its eyes glittering with malevolent intent. Carly backed away, terror flooding her veins. She turned and bolted for the door, but before she could reach it, she felt a cold hand grab her ankle, pulling her to the floor. She screamed, clawing at the ground, but the grip was impossibly strong. As she was dragged back toward the doll, she realized with growing horror that the doll's once innocent eyes were now filled with a dark, ancient hunger. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the doll's twisted smile. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was a cold October night, the kind where the wind seemed to howl through the trees like a restless spirit. Claire had just moved into her new home, an old, creaky house on the outskirts of town. She wasn't superstitious by any means, but the house had a certain presence to it, like it had been waiting for her. It was cheap, though, and Claire needed a place to live after her recent breakup. The isolation didn't bother her. In fact, she welcomed it. She was eager for a fresh start and didn't mind the house's quirks at first. The first few nights were uneventful. The usual creaks and groans of an old house settling were easy to ignore. But on the fourth night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, Claire heard it. A knock at the door. At first, she thought it was her imagination. It was well past midnight, and she lived in a rural area where unexpected visitors were rare. But the knock came again, louder this time. 3 steady, deliberate knocks. Claire's heart raced. She threw on her robe and tiptoed to the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but something inside her warned against opening it. After a few tense moments, she stepped back and went upstairs, thinking it was just a prank, or maybe the wind knocking something against the door. The next night, the knocks came again. 3 sharp raps, always around midnight. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She looked through the peephole once more, but again, the porch was empty. She double-checked the locks, drew the curtains, and went back to bed, her nerves on edge. By the third night, Claire was determined to get to the bottom of it. She stayed up late, waiting for the knocks. Right on cue, at midnight, they came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoing through the house. This time, she flung the door open without hesitation. No one was there. She stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air biting at her skin. Her yard was empty, and the road beyond her driveway was deserted. But something felt off. It was too quiet, as though the usual night sounds had been swallowed up by the darkness. That's when she saw it. Just beyond the tree line, at the edge of her yard, a figure stood motionless. It was tall, its shape shrouded in shadow. Claire couldn't make out any details, but she could feel its gaze on her, watching. She blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Heart racing, Claire hurried back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something was out there, something that had been watching her for nights now. The following day, Claire decided to talk to her neighbor, Mrs. Donahue, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades. She mentioned the strange knocks and the figure she had seen by the trees. Mrs. Donahue's face went pale. "You didn't open the door, did you?" she asked, her voice low and fearful. Claire shook her head. "No, but I almost did." "Why?" The old woman glanced around as if afraid someone might overhear them. "This house, it has a history. Years ago, a man lived here. He was reclusive, strange, and people in town said he was into dark things. One night, he vanished. They say his spirit still roams these parts, knocking on doors, looking for someone to let him back in." Claire's stomach churned. She wanted to laugh it off, but Mrs. Donahue's expression was deadly serious. "Whatever you do," the old woman continued, "never open that door at midnight." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. Mrs. Donahue's warning echoed in her mind, but she refused to believe it was more than an old ghost story. Still, When the clock struck midnight, she braced herself, waiting for the familiar knocks. But this time, there were no knocks. Silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Claire began to relax, thinking perhaps the ordeal was over. She closed her eyes, ready to drift off to sleep. Then, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Confused, she picked it up, her eyes squinting at the bright screen. There was a text from an unknown number. "Why didn't you open the door?" Claire's heart stopped. She stared at the message, her mind racing. How could someone know? How could anyone? The knock came again, 3 sharp, insistent raps at the front door. Claire's pulse quickened, her body frozen in fear. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The phone buzzed again. "I'm waiting." Trembling, Claire deleted the messages and turned off her phone. She pulled the covers up to her chin, squeezing her eyes shut, praying for morning to come. But the knocks persisted, growing louder and more frantic. The walls seemed to shake with the force of it, the sound reverberating through the entire house. The doorknob rattled as if something was trying to get in. Claire stayed under the covers, tears streaming down her face, repeating Mrs. Donahue's warning like a mantra. Never open the door. Never open the door. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The house fell deathly silent, the air heavy with tension. Claire waited, heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Then, from the other side of the room, she heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper that chilled her to the bone. "I'm already inside." Claire's blood ran cold as she felt a presence near her bed, the unmistakable sensation of someone, or something, standing over her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before everything went black was a shadowy figure looming over her, its face obscured by darkness and its cold breath on her skin. Claire was never seen again.
Story number 9.
There was a well in the center of the small, forgotten village of Ashmore. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, but no one dared use it anymore. The townsfolk whispered about the well, avoiding it at all costs. Children were warned never to go near it, and anyone who visited Ashmore would notice how the villagers cast nervous glances toward the moss-covered stone structure. No one knew exactly what happened if you listened too closely to the whispers from the well, but everyone agreed on one thing. Once you heard them, the well would never let you go. Ellie didn't believe in the local legends. She had recently moved to Ashmore, eager for a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. The stories about the well intrigued her, and the more people told her to stay away, the more she wanted to see it for herself. One foggy afternoon, curiosity got the better of her. After weeks of hearing the warnings, she decided to take a walk to the old well and see if there was any truth to the village's fears. The path to the well was overgrown with weeds, and the air grew cooler the closer she got. As she approached, the towering trees surrounding it seemed to form a natural barrier, like they were trying to protect, or perhaps hide, what lay within. When she finally reached the clearing, the well stood before her, covered in ivy and surrounded by an eerie stillness. The stone was cracked and weathered, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. There was something unsettling about the way it loomed in the clearing, as if it were waiting for her. Ellie stood at the edge, staring down into the darkness below. She couldn't see the bottom. The well seemed to descend endlessly into the earth. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around her, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard something. A faint whisper, so soft she wasn't sure if it was real or just her imagination. She leaned closer, straining to hear. The sound was barely there, like a breath carried on the wind. But then it grew clearer, an eerie, low murmur, too soft to make out words, but unmistakably a voice. Ellie's heart skipped a beat, and she pulled back, suddenly unsure of her decision. The well's cold air seemed to pull at her, as if beckoning her closer. She shook her head, trying to laugh off her nerves, and turned to leave. But as she walked away, the whispers grew louder. "Ellie!" She froze. Her blood turned to ice as she heard her name echo from the depths of the well. Slowly, against her better judgment, she turned back. The well was silent again, the air around it still. Her pulse quickened, but her feet moved on their own, carrying her back to the edge. She looked down once more, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness below seemed to shift, like something was moving within it. Then, just as she was about to step away again, the whispers returned. Clearer now, louder. "Ellie, help us." It wasn't just one voice, it was many, dozens, maybe more, calling to her in desperate, pleading tones. The voices were layered, overlapping, as if trapped within the well and trying to escape. She felt a cold chill run down her spine. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no response. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. Ellie stared into the well, her mind racing. Her logical side told her to run to get away from this cursed place, but something else, a strange compulsion, held her in place. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and leaned in further. Her fingertips grazed the cool stone, and as she did, the air around her grew colder still. The darkness below seemed to ripple, and for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving within it, twisted figures, their faces contorted in agony. Suddenly, one of the voices spoke again, this time clearer than before. "We've been waiting." Ellie jerked back, her heart hammering in her chest. She stumbled away from the well, her hands trembling. Whatever was down there, whatever was calling to her, wasn't human. It couldn't be. As she turned to leave, she felt a strange sensation, a tug, like invisible hands were reaching for her, pulling her back toward the well. Panic surged through her and she broke into a run, sprinting away from the clearing and back toward her house. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whispers echoing in the back of her mind. They were faint but persistent, like they were trying to break through her thoughts. She tossed and turned, trying to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop. "Ellie, come back. Help us." She pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to come from inside her head, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the well itself had followed her home. By dawn, Ellie was exhausted, her eyes red from lack of sleep. But the voices had quieted, leaving her in a tense, uneasy silence. She thought it was over, that maybe the whispers were just a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The next few days passed in a blur. Ellie avoided the well, but no matter where she went in the village, she could feel its pull. The whispers were always there, lurking in the back of her mind, growing louder each night. One evening, unable to take it anymore, she decided to return to the well. Maybe if she went back, she could confront whatever was down there and put an end to it. As she approached the clearing, her heart pounded in her chest. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the trees seemed darker than before. The well loomed ahead, and the whispers were louder than ever, swirling around her like a cold wind. "Ellie, please, help us." Without thinking, she stepped closer. Her body moved on its own, drawn to the edge of the well. The voices were deafening now, pleading, crying, begging for her to listen. She leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness below, and then something reached up. A cold, skeletal hand shot out from the well, grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. Ellie screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand tightened, dragging her toward the edge. More hands followed, pale and twisted, reaching out from the darkness. The last thing she heard before she was pulled into the well was the whisper of countless voices, all speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you." The village of Ashmore remains quiet to this day. But if you visit the old well at the center of town, you might still hear the faintest of whispers carried on the wind. And if you listen closely, you might hear Ellie's voice among them.
Story number 10.
Megan had always been fascinated by the old mansion on Oak Hollow Road. As a child, she used to pass by it on her way to school, staring up at its towering spires and cracked, ivy-covered walls. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone in town could remember, yet it seemed to breathe with its own life, watching and waiting. Rumor had it that the house was cursed, that anyone who spent a night inside would either vanish or come out completely mad. Of course, Megan never believed such nonsense. Now, as a 26-year-old journalist looking for her next big story, she saw an opportunity. She had always wanted to write something that would get people talking, and investigating a supposedly haunted house was perfect. Armed with her camera, notebook, and flashlight, Megan made her way to the mansion on a cool October evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew, and the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. The massive front door groaned as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the vast, empty hall. Dust swirled in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows, and the air inside was stale, heavy with years of neglect. Megan clicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The interior of the mansion was just as eerie as she'd imagined. Antique furniture covered in dusty white sheets, faded portraits hanging crookedly on the walls, and cobwebs in every corner. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she wandered from room to room, snapping photos and jotting down notes. It wasn't until she reached the second floor that Megan felt it, the strange pull. She stood in the narrow hallway, her flashlight flickering for just a moment. That's when she noticed a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar as if inviting her in. Her heart rate quickened, and she hadn't noticed the door before, though she'd been sure she had checked all the rooms. Something about it seemed wrong, but the journalist in her pushed her forward. She had to know what was inside. As she approached the door, she felt the air around her grow colder, almost oppressive. The door creaked open further, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, save for a single chair sitting in the center. The walls were bare, the windows boarded up, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. But there was something about the room that made Megan hesitate. It was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that felt alive, as if the very room was listening, waiting. She stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath her weight. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Megan spun around, heart hammering in her chest. She rushed to the door and twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, shouting for help, though she knew no one would hear her. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but then she heard it. A voice. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. It seemed to come from all around her, filling the room with its haunting tone. Megan? Her blood ran cold. The voice knew her name. She stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she swept it across the room. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew even colder. The voice spoke again, clearer this time. Megan, sit down. Her eyes darted to the chair in the center of the room. Something deep inside her screamed, don't, but the voice was so soothing, so insistent. Sit down, it whispered, closer now, as though it were right beside her. She backed away from the chair, shaking her head. No, I'm not sitting, she muttered to herself, trying to keep control of her thoughts. The voice grew harsher, louder, as if angry. Sit down, Megan. Suddenly, the walls around her began to tremble, the floor vibrating beneath her feet. The light from her flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Her heart raced as she felt an invisible force pressing down on her, pushing her toward the chair. Megan, sit. The command echoed in her mind, filling her thoughts until she could hardly think straight. Her legs felt heavy, her body drawn to the chair. Against her will, she found herself stepping toward it, the pull stronger than her fear. She reached the chair and slowly sat down, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment she did, the room went completely silent. The air, still and suffocating, pressed down on her. She tried to move, but her body felt like it was frozen in place. Then, in the corner of the room, a figure appeared. It was barely visible at first, just a dark shape in the shadows, but it slowly became more defined. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. She was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown, her hair tangled and wet, as if she had just emerged from a lake. The woman stood in the corner, staring at Megan with those empty eyes. Megan's breath hitched. Her body wouldn't respond, as though she was trapped in the chair, her limbs heavy and useless. The woman moved forward, her feet gliding soundlessly over the floor. She stopped in front of Megan, leaning down until her face was inches from hers. You shouldn't have come here, the woman whispered, her breath cold against Megan's skin. Megan wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. The woman's eyes bore into hers and in them Megan saw something terrible. Images of people all sitting in the same chair, their faces twisted in fear and agony, their bodies trapped, just as she was now. The woman's lips curled into a smile, one that chilled Megan to her core. You belong to the room now, the woman whispered. The room began to spin, the walls warping and twisting. The last thing Megan saw before everything went black was the woman's cold, dead eyes, watching her as the darkness consumed her. The next morning, when a local real estate agent entered the mansion to prepare it for sale, she found the house just as it always was, silent and still. But in one of the upstairs rooms, sitting in an old chair in the center of the floor, was Megan. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth frozen in a silent scream, but she didn't move. No matter how hard anyone tried, they couldn't get her to wake up, because Megan was no longer there. Story the end.